I just went from rank 80 to rank 272 with a certain deck. I guess you'll have to find out during the tier list which one that is. Anyways, let's jump right into it. Alright, welcome to the tier list. Now, I'm hiding Esper Control, it's bottom right, but we'll get to that. That's the last deck I'm going to cover anyways. But yeah, here's how we're going to do this. Of course, this review is going to be, or this tier list is going to be purely subjective. It's based off my experience with all these decks, playing them, playing against them, talking to people who have played them. And of course, I will be ranking them in their respective tiers that I think they go into, and also ranking them within that tier. So the deck that's furthest to the left is going to be the better one in that tier, and the deck that's furthest to the right is going to be the worst one in that tier. Now, I haven't played all of these decks, but of course, you know, I feel like some of these I don't really have to play them. There's a general consensus about if they're good or not. And, you know, if you think I'm wrong, go ahead and let me know in the comments. All right, let's start things off with Rakdos Anvil, the first deck on the list. Now, this has gone through many changes compared to the previous one, which is more of like a Shield Red Fable type of deck. I think the best version of this deck now is definitely this one. Exuberant Fuseling is a very aggressive, very powerful scaling one-drop that gains power when when an artifact leaves the battlefield under your control, and when a creature leaves the battlefield, well, goes into the graveyard. I think it specifically goes in the graveyard from the battlefield. So yeah, this card, if you draw Fuseling and you manage to find like a Epicure into Gleeful Demolition, that's like that's a very strong board state for turn 2. Now the question is, how often can you hit that with a very low land count of 22, I think. So a lot of people are running, yeah, much lower lands than the average deck, which right now is running 26. Since this is an aggro deck, top of the curve is 2, it makes sense. But you still have to hit your land drops because you're going to need enough mana to weave in all these 1 mana spells. But I think the problem, unfortunately, with this deck is that we still have Brotherhood's End in the format, and that is a card that is quite represented, I think, at least in Mythic. Brotherhood's End, Loran, Abrade, Shield Red. It's a lot. It's a lot to overcome for any aggro deck, and there's a reason that aggro is not viable in this format. But I will say that in terms of aggro decks, this might be one of the better ones, just because it is doing something that is a little bit unfair. And the unfairness comes from the Oni Cult Anvil itself being a very, very annoying permanent to deal with, and especially in multiples, can create a very oppressive board state, and it requires that Brother's End. And if they don't find the Brother's End, then you might actually be able to take over. So I don't know. I would say this deck is probably low tier 2, as in it has potential, but I don't think it's quite good enough. I don't know if I'm supposed to put it in tier 3 or tier 2. I don't want to discount this deck too much, just because I feel like the mana base is so good with the cliffs as well. You have the fast land now, so it has like nearly perfect mana base, I would say. It's just lacking consistent good matchups. I feel like it has some matchups that will feel very difficult with like a bunch of Brother's Ends and Lorans, like potentially Farewell if you can't kill your opponent fast enough. And some decks are including some life gain as well, which is kind of dangerous, obviously, for a deck like this. So I think, unfortunately, yeah, this deck, I'm going to play it safe here. I don't want to discount it too much again. I do think this deck has some potential. So I'm going to put it in tier 2, but it will most likely be at the bottom of tier 2. So I'm just placing it in tier 2 for now. But it will not be high in that list. It might even be the last deck in tier 2, but we'll see. We're not there yet. All right, next up, we have this deck right here. Izzet Ramp? Or is it Artifacts? That wasn't a question, by the way. But Izzet Ramp is a deck that has been in Standard in the past. Of course, these are just deck examples. I just took these from whatever MTGA zone or anything I could find that if it wasn't the deck that I previously had, and this wasn't one of them. Of course, you make modifications for the current Standard. You need more counterspells for Atraxa, etc. But this is just a visual representation of what a deck might look like. Of course, don't take these like literally. I'm not rating these off of the literal deck list. Okay. So, Izzet Ramp is a deck that might actually be pretty good. Unfortunately, it's a deck I have not had the time to test yet. I just kind of forgot it existed until someone reminded me yesterday. And now that I think about it, like everything revolves around Atraxa right now. Atraxa is like the card that's just played everywhere, at least in Mythic. And I think this deck might have something to kind of combat that, and mostly because of Skitterbeam Battalion. Skitterbeam Battalion is going to be a card that's almost impossible to deal with for them because it's haste, and they don't really have that many instant speed interactions. And first of all, they obviously can't play a sweeper at instant speed, so at least you might be able to attack with 8 damage, with 8 power, even if they remove 1, so that's pretty good. And I think blue obviously is a very good color because you need counter spells to get rid of Atraxa when it's cast. So all in all, and it also has access to red, so Brotherhood's End, you have like pretty much two of the best colors right now to fight off a multitude of decks. With Abrade, Brotherhood's End, obviously Fable, best card in Standard probably. And then you also have kind of that unfair aspect to it with the Mightstone, Weakstone being incredible value for 5, the Battalion that's incredible value period, whether it's on 5 or 9, Cityscape Leveler the same thing, like a lot of cards that are doing things that are a little bit unfair. Now they're not like Atraxa unfair, but you know, they still fit in that category in some way. So honestly, even without testing this deck, off of pure theory, I've not even faced anybody playing this. I actually think Izzet is probably either high tier 2 or mid tier 2. That's my guess. I'm gonna play it safe and say it's probably mid tier 2, just because obviously I don't know truly if this deck has a spot in the metagame yet. When it comes to competing against the tier 1 decks, because I would actually have to test that. But I think in theory it is pretty good. But I'll have to test it out. Moving on to Esper Walkers, we have a deck that, I mean, this list doesn't have Experimental Augury, but I know some lists are playing it. I don't know if this is the better version or not. I have not personally played the deck. I've played against it. I know a lot of people who have played it, and I've heard that it is actually not terrible. I don't think this deck will really have a spot in the metagame, because if you're going this route, I feel like, well, I guess we'll get to that later, but I do feel like pure control is probably better, like not relying on permanents at all. That way you don't have to worry about tapping out and your opponent resolving something powerful, like an Invoke or an Atraxa. So I think pure control probably does a better job at competing against what's currently at the top of the metagame, which I guess we'll find out later, but I mean, I've already kind of spoiled that. Atraxa is everywhere. I won't say whether it's at the top or not, but it's very popular. Let's just say that. So a deck that's very popular in Mythic, and this deck does okay against it. It's not bad, but is it better than other alternatives? I don't really know. Either way, I think this deck is just solidly in tier 2. It's not really gonna be a bad deck, but it's not gonna be an incredible deck. So I think it lands closer to mid or low mid tier 2. So like probably obviously better than Rakdos, but I don't think it's better than Izzet Ramp, just because Izzet Ramp is going to be a much cleaner list, a much more a tighter deck to in terms of consistency. It's going to be a lot more consistent because you're not relying on like combining a bunch of planeswalkers with the gauntlet and stuff like that. Your average card is going to be doing its job better than an Esper Walkers, I feel like. And that's pretty important. Moving on to Jund with Tyvar. So this strategy has Cankerbloom in the sideboard. It's got Armored Scrapgorger, Tyvar to kind of turbo out mana or get the Scrapgorger, the Bloodtide Harvester back. It's got Visionary as well that can get cards back from your graveyard to your hand in the very late game, and you can also get it back with Tyvar and then activate it, put it back in your hand, etc. So Jund Tyvar is probably the best version of Jund right now. Relying on a planeswalker is very key, I think, in this metagame, especially a cheap one. A cheap one in a deck that also has Fable and Invoke, so very high power level cards, very tight game plan. Armored Scrapgorger is fantastic for interacting with the graveyard. Glissa's okay. Shieldred is a good card, obviously. So you have the right colors. You're in the right colors. Now, green is not that well positioned right now. It's okay, but the problem again, I think it comes back around to Atraxa, which is again the main point of this metagame. I think right now, as it stands, is that Atraxa is very popular, and your performance against Atraxa decks, I think, is key. And unfortunately, Jund is just not in the right colors to really be able to interact with Atraxa positively. And that pretty much the only color that can do well against Atraxa, I think, is blue. So I do believe right now, if you don't have blue in your deck, you're starting from behind. You're starting from way behind, because if Atraxa resolved, you probably lose on it. Most of the time, you probably lose. So your goal is going to be to, make Atraxa not resolve. And the only way to do that, I think, is with blue. Or if you're lucky enough to hit like a Pilfer on it, but then they have 3 more. I don't know. It's a little rough. I think Jun's speed is just not fast enough to compete with a deck like Atraxa. And that puts it pretty much low tier 2, as in the deck is not bad, but it just simply cannot really compete. So I think obviously I'm going to put this higher than Rakdos just because it's still mid-range. It still has some of the best cards in Standard. It has Fable, it has Shieldred, it has Invoke, it has Harvester, it has good removal, it has good mana. All in all, very good things. Unfortunately, not the right things, I think, to get pushed above. And one of the reasons I think this might actually be worse than Esper Walkers is because obviously Esper Walkers has blue. I think that's a huge upside in this metagame. So you're gonna see a lot of blue decks ranking higher than other decks that don't have blue. Even though on a 1-to-1 basis, if you compare both of them, Jund would probably be a better deck than Esper Walkers. But in this metagame, I don't think that's the case. At least from what I've analyzed from my personal experience in Mythic, which is the whole point of this tier list, anyways. Is just me rating decks. Anyways, the next deck I don't have an example of, but it's pretty much Jund without Tyvar, without the Scrap Wardrobe, or whatever. What's it called? The the Armored Scrap Wardrobe. So without any, so no Glissa as well, or you can play like a few Glissa. But I'm just talking about a deck that has Bankbuster, a deck that has Fable, that has Trespasser maybe as another 3-drop, that has more Shieldreds, that has Invoke, that has Grixis Command, maybe has like a Serpent with Blade Coil Serpent. So a more standard Jund. And I think that version of Jund is just a lesser version of the Jund Tyvar deck. So I'm gonna place the Jund Invoke deck. Probably, I almost want to place it lower than Rakdos. I don't know. I believe that Rakdos could have like a better potential better time in Standard than just regular Jund, which I think is not. So it's gonna have Unleash the Inferno as well, stuff like that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just don't think Jund is that well positioned unless you're doing something a little bit more unfair, and that would include Tyvar. It's pretty close between Rakdos and Jund, I think. Jund Invoke. But we're going to place Jund Invoke a little bit higher than Rakdos, because at least Jund Invoke has proven itself to be good, I think. I have not seen anybody really playing the Rakdos Anvil deck, but I have seen some people on just regular Jund. They're about the same, honestly, but I'll still place Jund a little bit higher than Rakdos, just because it has access to green, and green has more interaction for permanents or permanent types that are really annoying in this format. So yeah. Next up, we have Mono Red, which is a deck that has, fallen off harder and harder over time as more sets come out, in best of 3 at least. And this is unfortunately no exception. The deck is very poorly positioned. It cannot go fast enough to compete with the mid-range decks. It cannot play mid-range better than the mid-range decks, obviously. So it's kind of just stuck in a position where, sure, you might be able to get a few free wins from being on the play and hitting like a perfect curve out, and your opponent doesn't have any answer to it. But when you find yourself on the draw, that complicates things a lot. Shieldred's still in the metagame. Brotherhood's End is still in the metagame, obviously. Laran is still good against this deck. A lot of destroy effects in Black Cut Down. Now we have people playing Strangle as well. It's a lot to overcome for Mono Red. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to overcome, and unfortunately, I just think that in a singular color, this might be, well, obviously there's Mono Green that's not even on the list, but this might be, or is clearly, I think, the weakest out of all the monocolor decks. But we'll talk about that when we get to the other ones. That's a little bit sad, but yeah, Mono Red aggro, unfortunately, is our first tier 3 deck. All right, next up we have Mono Black. Mono Black is a deck that was very good in the previous season, before the set came out. And unfortunately, in best of 3, it has fallen off quite a bit. And the reason for that is Atraxa. So Atraxa became a deck, first of all, and it's a deck with a ton of sweepers, and it's a deck with a lot of permanent types. So Invoke becomes a little bit weaker. Even decks that did rise up before the Atraxa deck became a thing, like Mono White. Mono White was already a hard matchup, but now with Ossification, it's even better for them because they have an other enchantment, so they will just deny you the draw and give you back like a small creature that they can just sweep the next turn. In a sweeper meta with Brotherhood's End, with Loran running around, with decks running Atraxa, obviously, it's just rough. It's a rough time. A lot of blue counterspell decks that are also running sweepers, so they can counter your Invoke and then sweep your Trespasser, so they don't even have to go through ward. They don't even have to go through your wards. People like most of the control decks are either going to be an Esper, so they have access to Edict, Voidrend. Now we have like, yeah, the Edict is also another huge upside for other decks facing Mono Black, because one of the key factors that made this deck so good was the wards and the kind of additional value you gain from playing a creature that was a lot more difficult to remove than just a standard creature with no ward, right? Like Flesh Gorger, they would have to take 3. Trespasser, they would have to discard a card. Underdog, they would have to deal with it coming out of the graveyard. But unfortunately, the meta is just not lining up for a deck with just one color, and that relies on Invoke for card draw, and with all the permanents that are, with all the enchantments that are being run and all the planeswalkers, it's simply become a deck that is unreliable, I think, unfortunately. I'll still try to make it work eventually, try to find like the best possible list, but for now, just taking one of my previous lists, this deck would just not perform well enough, unfortunately. And I don't think it got anything impactful, anything that's really impactful from the new cards to boost it up from its pretty bad position. Unfortunately, Mono Black will be joining Mono Red in Tier 3. Now, that's not to say that these decks are remotely close in terms of viability. I do think Mono Black is way better than Mono Red, but I'm not going to put Mono Red in jank tier. Honestly, maybe I could, but Mono Black is just, it's an okay deck. But okay is just not going to cut it. It is the unfair things it was doing in the past are simply not good enough anymore. With decks gaining Might, the 1-drop that can give hexproof and unblockable, you can no longer use your spot removal easily against decks that were previously a good matchup, like Esper Raffine. So Esper Legends was a very good matchup for Mono Black with the Lily and with the Invoke Despair in general. But now that's kind of no longer the case, because you can't really play a Lily against a 1/1, a 1-mana 1/1. You just spend your entire turn pretty much doing nothing. And then also the fact that, other decks have gained sack effects, essentially. That's all there is to it. It's just gotten worse. The other decks have gained more tools to combat Mono Black, but in Mono Black just kind of gain nothing. Like, they gain more sack effects, except sack effects against other decks are not as good as they are against Mono Black itself. So that's unfortunate. And yeah, I do think the deck is still fine, but unfortunately it's not doing anything that pushes it up in tier 2, essentially. It just stayed the same while all the other decks have improved. Esper Legends, a deck that I completely dominated the metagame challenge with and got like 60 something packs with overall. So yeah, you're probably gonna guess where I'm gonna place this one, but if you don't know what the hell this deck does, it's pretty much just the best curve out deck, I think. Yeah, no, it has to be. Yeah, it has to be the best curve out deck. Starting on turn 1 with pretty much incredible mana. You don't even have to use the triomes, so you have those fast lands that really added consistency to your early game. Skrelv is probably the best 1-drop in the game right now, not even close, I think. And it has incredible synergy in this deck to begin with, allowing you to gain unblock. So one of your creatures can gain unblockable in the late game against a certain color. So that's incredibly devastating when people are trying to potentially block some damage and you're very close to winning. So you have that aspect, but obviously the most important is just you can tap it for 2 life. So it doesn't even have to use mana. You can tap it for 2 life at instant speed in response to a removal spell, and you can give your creature that's being targeted hexproof. So that's incredibly broken. It forces removal spells on the might, which usually those removal spells are going to cost more than the might itself, so usually 2 mana on average. And that also allows your other creatures to just live naturally. So not only can it protect those other creatures from removal spells, but if it does get removed, it will also technically save one of your other creatures from getting removed. So overall, it's a very cheap investment for the amount of impact it will have on the game. It's really incredible. It pretty much took the deck that was already good and made it twice as good, I think. I'm not joking. The might and the fast land make this deck quite insane compared to previously, because obviously now you're dodging potential removal on your other creatures. And yeah, I'm going to be placing Esper Legends solidly in tier 1. Now I still have to think about if it's at the top or not, but I guess we'll find out when this tier list is over. Blue White Soldiers, a deck that has gotten worse, I think, than before. Unfortunately, everybody's running sweepers, as I mentioned with mono black, and sweepers are really annoying for for blue whites. Really annoying. And also, people are running, so in the Atraxa decks, people are running Strangle as well, which is incredibly annoying. People are just respecting Thalia a little bit more, I think, in their deck, because they know that their deck is naturally clunky against Thalia, so they've prepared answers for those early game creatures that are gonna really try to take over the game. So unfortunately, soldiers, I've tested the deck. I've tried many different versions, and they all just seem too clunky to work. It's a deck with the top of curve that stops at 3, which makes it a little bit troublesome when you find like 5-6 mana. Usually you're in a weird spot, so you want to hit 3 mana and then maybe hit your 4th and try to like play double 2-drop. But the main problem with the deck is just that the mana does not cooperate enough for you to truly take over the game. Like sometimes you'll draw 1 extra land, that's going to be the breaking point. Sometimes you won't draw enough lands, that's also going to be a breaking point. Like, too many things can go wrong, and that inconsistency really takes a hit on the deck overall, on the deck's performance overall. Now I know some people are running the Skrelv as well, the Might, and that is something I haven't tested. That might actually make the deck a little bit better, but it still does not protect you against sweepers. So yeah, I think it's just unfortunate circumstance that now there are control decks trying to beat Atraxa that are running sweepers, and there's Atraxa that's also running sweepers, and we have Brotherhood Zen and other decks that are not like Grixis has access to Brotherhood Zen, Jund has access to Brotherhood Zen. Too many red black decks. Shieldred is a huge problem still. This deck lacks interaction. Because if you like, obviously this deck doesn't have Cathar, but I would play Cathar in the main deck. But just saying, even with Cathar, it's not a reliable removal spell. And with all the sweepers running around, if you Cathar something and then they sweep you, it's just kind of over. So ideally, you'd want to play counter magic in the main deck, but then like with Thalia, you tax your own counter magic. So it's just this deck is just it just has too many faults. It has too many faults. It's just not consistent enough. And in terms of aggro, honestly, I would almost argue that Rakdos is a better deck. I think I'm actually gonna put this lower than Rakdos. It might be tier 3, honestly. It might be tier 3. It might be tier 3. Okay, I'm gonna put soldiers higher than mono black in tier 3. Honestly, wait, mono red should just go in jank tier at this point. I'm thinking about it. But it's not actually a jank deck. I don't really know if this tier should be renamed. Alright, I just realized that I needed another tier for mono red, because I don't think mono red fits in the same category as mono black and blue white. And the Rakdos deck also doesn't fit in the same category as the Jund, Esper Walkers, and Izzet. So I made tier 3 and extended the lower tier to tier 4, where I placed mono red. And then we have Rakdos Blue-White Soldiers. I do think Rakdos is probably worse than Blue-White, so let's do this. We got Blue-White Soldiers, Rakdos, Mono Black, then Mono Red. Still no trash tier deck, so we're getting to that. Okay. Blue-White Mindsplice or any Mindsplice apparatus deck, like it could be Jeskai. I think that's pretty much all I've seen is Jeskai or Blue-White. And I believe both of those decks are about similar in power level. Blue-White has better mana base and more access to cards like Mirax, Blaststone, Field of Ruin. Also has an easier time not taking damage from Pain Lands and stuff like that, but you do have Union to gain life in the Jeskai deck as well. But both are pretty clunky because they're using Mindsplice. First of all, this card enables your opponent to use their bad spells. What I mean by that is that usually control decks will have 0 targets for a card like Abrade and 0 targets for a card like Loran. And giving your opponent opportunities to use those cards is actually not good, especially if those cards are very common. Also, you have to consider the fact that people are running leyline bindings in Atraxa decks. So essentially, you're using a card that your opponents will have answers to in their main deck, which they would have nothing to use on. Like those cards would be dead cards. So you're enabling those cards to be live cards. And also what you're getting in as a reward is -1 cost on that turn, like on when you untap. And that is, unfortunately, that is not a very strong effect. So you need Mindsplice Apparatus to stick for multiple turns before it becomes truly impactful. And then you need to have card draw in your hand for you to actually compensate for the fact that you just lost a card to reduce your other card's mana cost. And then if you draw another Mindsplice, it's that's just the problem. The problem is that the card itself does not progress your game plan in any meaningful way. It's trying to enable you to do more unfair things. But control does not need to do that many more unfair things. It already has like big sweepers. It already has decent mana efficiency. What we're trying to do here is just make the deck more explosive, which is not typical of control, and unfortunately does not really work when it relies on an artifact specifically. And that's the entire problem, I think. The card is just a horrendous top deck as well. It's very awkward in multiples. It requires a ton of card draw in your deck, so the slots it's taking are very very felt. Like you can really feel that you're spending four slots potentially to play Mindsplice when you have to compensate by adding even more card draw. And then you're gonna lack removal, so you're gonna have to hit your sweepers. But if they have counter magic, then it's like it's tough because you really need balance, and Apparatus disrupts that balance in a control deck. With all that said, I don't actually think this deck is too bad. It has good matchups against Atraxa, obviously, and that is a huge pull towards the deck. But here's my issue. I think the deck would be even better against Atraxa without Mindsplice. So that's the unfortunate part, is that I'm going to have to rate this lower than I would rate a blue-white control deck, just straight up. Because the card Mindsplice Apparatus, I don't think adds enough in a positive way for a control deck that needs every one of its cards to be impactful. And when I say impactful, I mean usually you want your card to either interact with your opponent's board state or progress your own game plan. And Apparatus kind of does neither. It relies on your other cards. So you have to combine 2 cards to make Mindsplice Apparatus good. And usually Control wants each card to be good by itself. So unfortunately, Mindsplice Apparatus will probably be going at the top of tier 3. But I do think, obviously, since I'm rating this for the current meta, that it is in an okay position, because it's going to be quite good against Atraxa decks, but it will not be good against Esper Legends, for example. Alright, up next we have Abzan Legends, which is a deck that is trying to replicate what Esper Legends is doing, except to replace the blue with green. And I actually think that makes the deck way worse. So I played a lot of this deck, and this is actually the deck that has lost me many ranks in Mythic Ladder. I just think it is way too clunky and inconsistent. Like, the power level is kind of there. Rata and Glissa combo together really well, so Rata will give Glissa Vigilance, which is huge. Glissa by itself is okay. Melira is a good card. Like, they're all good cards, but I think they're just straight up worse than their counterparts. As in, Glissa being worse than Rafine, because Rafine gives you that consistency, which is very, very key in a deck like this, because you want to make sure you're never flooding. You want to make sure that each of your creatures can attack, and Rafine just enables your entire deck pretty much to be as good as it is in those color combinations. So like losing that blue for consistency makes the deck maybe a tiny bit more powerful if you hit perfectly. I don't even know if that's the case, but theoretically, if you curve out a Might into like a Thalia, into Glissa, into Rata, that's pretty good. I don't even know if that's better than hitting like a Might Thalia Rafine into Shield Red or something, or into Rata itself again. Like I don't actually think that's more powerful. First of all, because Rafine has ward and is harder to remove than Glissa, I feel like, even though it gets hit by cut down, the fact that they still have to spend 2 mana, and then if you have a Skrelv, that doesn't even matter, right? They would have to use the cut down on Skrelv anyways, so usually the cut down is already used on Skrelv or Thalia if you hit the nuts, right? Glissa is only going to be better in a situation where you probably have they removed your other creatures and it's the last creature remaining. And in that case, you'd rather have a Glissa than a Rafine, because Rafine relies on other creatures to really snowball the game. But that is not really a situation that is too common in Esper with the Might, with Denic, with the like Denic. I think is actually arguably better than Melira. Sure, Melira, you can exile it to protect something else, but Denic is just insane, man. With Rafine, you can basically ditch it into the graveyard and then bring it out, and then when you discard another creature, it makes a clue. Like, it's ridiculous. And also the lifelink is a huge aspect of why Denic is so good. This deck is just simply inconsistent. That's my problem with it. It's too inconsistent, and it lacks reliability, and that puts it in a very awkward position in a metagame that needs consistency. It requires consistency, and this deck just simply does not have it. So I'm going to place Abzan Legends in tier 3. I think it's worse than Soldiers. I think Soldiers has more consistency and potentially more blowouts, like more consistent blowouts than Abzan does, because Abzan requires a combination of very specific cards to work together, while Soldiers can most of the time just kind of stumble upon a curve and potentially snowball from that point on. But Abzan requires like you to hit actually perfect, and that is something that is pretty rough. But the power level is definitely there, so I still think it's playable, but I don't think it's very good. All right, next up we have Mardu Tokens. Now, of course, as I said before, these are just lists that I picked up randomly. I know there are other lists. I've played this list, another list with Jadar, another list with Skrelvhive, and all of them have been bad. All of them have been bad. And I think unfortunately Mondrak as a card is not in a great position because there are so many board wipes, as I mentioned prior. The key thing here is that Mondrak goes wide, and the creature itself is not very good. It does not have a static effect that is actually relevant in this metagame, unlike Shield Red. So like you're in the Shield Red colors, right? So you need a very good argument to not play Shield Red, and Mondrak does not have that argument. Mondrak, 4 mana 4/4. Any token you when it's on the battlefield, you double the amount of tokens you make from sources. So Wedding Announcement will make 2. Skitterbeam will copy itself 4 times instead of twice, which is good. The problem is, if you don't have Mondrak, the deck is not great. And if you find Mondrak, it has to survive, and then you need something that can make tokens. So everything has to come out perfectly. It's kind of in a similar spot to Abzan Legends, but even worse than that, because it has no speed attached to it. It has no genuine powerful curve out other than exactly Requisitioner into like Ob or something on the play, or like Harvester into Wedding into Mondrak. Like, it, even that curve is not that good. Like, it's underwhelming. It doesn't, none of these creatures or these token generators put that much pressure on your opponent's life total. It just puts an immense amount of pressure on the board, which usually will just get swept. Like, the problem is it lacks blue, I think, for counter magic, where that would be able to potentially protect yourself from a sweeper instead of relying on cards like Duress that can be unreliable against decks with a lot of sweepers, where they can just simply top deck out of it. And this deck on the draw just feels absolutely miserable. It has like no speed. It's so slow to get going. It's just embarrassing. And yeah, I think I thought this deck would have been good, and until I played it, and then I realized that it is simply just not what you want to be doing in this meta, and that puts it in a very bad position. As such, Mardu Tokens is going into tier 4 with mono red, although it's better than mono red, I think, just because it has that potential blowout where it has the potential to do something unfair, which I think mono red can do, but there are too many ways, I think, to counteract mono red, whereas Mardu will require sweeper, and there are some decks that do not have that. Next on the list is Mardu Midrange, which is unfortunately in a terrible position right now, but that is because of Atraxa, obviously. Honestly, I probably should have I probably should have ranked Atraxa, but you can clearly guess where that's going. Mardu Midrange, a deck with no blue, a mid-range deck. Hearing those two together should clue you in as to why this deck is bad. And it's mostly because it just gets steamrolled completely against Atraxa. Like, there is almost nothing you can possibly do in this color combination that will allow you to win against Atraxa. You have no counter magic. You have okay permanent interaction. They can just sweep your board state. They have farewells. Like, you can't set up permanents. They can exile your graveyard. They can have counter magic, so that's already a problem. Mardu is a deck that doesn't really interact well with counter spells from your opponent's side as well. They have ways to deal with your permanents as well, of course. Bankbuster, they could have Abray, they could have Loran. It's just too slow. Like, your deck is too slow to compete with Atraxa, which is actually gain speed. It's not just trying to cast a 7-drop on curve. It's actually getting it out much earlier than you'd want. And that is a huge problem to deal with because you have no counter magic. So that puts Mardu Midrange, unfortunately, in tier 3, I think. Clearly in a very bad position, in my opinion. I don't think it's in a good spot at all. Now, is it better or worse than Blue-White Soldiers? Now, is it better or worse than Soldiers? I actually think Mardu is probably better than Soldiers. And the reason for that is, sure, it loses to Atraxa, but it still has decent matchups into the other tier 1 decks. Well, obviously Atraxa's in there, but the other deck is coming up soon as well. It actually has an okay matchup into Esper. So, sure, you're going to lose to, like, Atraxa 80% of the time. No, maybe less than that. Honestly, in Magic, there's no like 80% loss, especially if your deck is remotely good at all. So maybe 65, 35, something like that. 65, 35 or something around those lines. And I mean, that's pretty bad already. I do think it's worse than Blue-White Mindsplice because Blue-White has blue, obviously. So I just think Soldier's in a really bad spot. Like, at least with Mardu, you will beat up on most of the random decks, because you have like a bunch of sweepers, you have like good permanents, so you can still win most of your other matches. You're just gonna hard lose to Atraxa, and you'll probably lose to control decks pretty hard. Actually, not necessarily. I don't know. It's hard to evaluate Mardu exactly, but I'm gonna put it in tier 3 above Soldiers. Like, I still think the deck is solid. It just, unfortunately, is positioned poorly in this metagame right now just because of Atraxa, but that could easily change once either Atraxa is pushed out of the metagame or nothing, I guess. Atraxa has to go get out of the metagame before Mardu can move up to like tier 2 or tier 1 potentially. Next on the list is the one and only the Grixis, and a deck that had to adapt to the metagame a little bit to compensate for the fact that yeah, it didn't have enough lands, it didn't have enough bombs, it didn't have enough push to really close out the game. And that's where Blade Coil Serpent comes in. This is a metagame where you need to be doing broken things, and Blade Coil Serpent does do that. Blade Coil Serpent does broken things, as does most of the rest of the deck, except Blade Coil Serpent gives you an extra damage source. So the haste is a key factor. The discard is a huge factor in why this card is good as well. And obviously the flexibility overall of having a 6-drop that can draw, discard, haste. Like, the flexibility of this card is what pushes this deck to remain at the top or near the top. Grixis will be solidly placed into tier 1, and it will be placed above Esper Legends. And the reason for that is because of its matchup spread. So Grixis is a good deck against Esper, and is also a good deck against Atraxa, because it has counter magic and discard spells potentially. And those two things mean that, you know, if you have two matchups that are also in tier 1 that are good, that makes the deck good automatically, I think. Now, they're not like guaranteed wins by any stretch. It's still an uphill battle. Like, these decks are going to be relatively close in power level, and facing each other will be very dependent on play draw. And honestly, their average win rate against each other will only spread by about, like, you know, 55-45, so by 10%. So yeah, 10% on average, 10% differential in win loss. But still, I think Grixis has a huge edge in terms of just strictly having counter magic in the main deck, and also having absurd amount of card draw, having a toolbox of responses to different permanents, to enchantments with Invoke, to exile creatures with Soul Transfer, Abrade, destroy artifacts, Grixis command a Sweeper, Brotherhood's End, destroy artifacts, or Sweep, and obviously the counter magic and the spot removal. And then discarding with Blade Coil Serpent. Overall, just the toolkit is too big. There's too many different tools in these colors, and the mana base has only gotten better with the inclusion of fast lands. Mono White is pretty good, except it sucks against Atraxa. So it sucks against Atraxa, and I think it's fine against Esper, but it's still starting from. I think it's okay against Esper, but Esper can just snowball any matchup, so it's not that consistent. This sucks. I love Mono White, but Atraxa is just so broken against it. Like, you have no answer to it whatsoever. The only thing you can do is play like 2 Stonebrain and sideboard, and even then I'm not even sure you win, because they also have Farewells, which is one of your the cards that is most impactful against you. They have Sweepers that can target hit Planeswalkers. They have immense card draw. If you don't hit the Stonebrain, you're losing, so you're relying on another card to be drawn in time before they can like turn 5 Atraxa or something. Yeah. There's not much to say about Mono White, except that it sucks against Atraxa. But yeah, it will still be going in tier 2. I don't know. What am I supposed to place this in tier 3 just because it sucks against Atraxa? I don't think so, because if you look at the other two matchups, Grixis and Esper, those are pretty good matchups. So it definitely is still good. But if you face Atraxa, it's like it's such a bad matchup. It's one of the worst ever matchups possible. Yeah, I think Mono White will be going in tier 2. In what position? Probably higher than Jund, because I think it's a better deck, but not higher than the blue decks. I think blue decks have potential. Well, any counter spell deck, I think, that is even remotely consistent, I think, is pretty good in this metagame. So yeah, I'll place Mono White in mid tier 2. Up next, we have a premier best of 1 deck, except I'm rating best of 3. And that means that this deck is garbage. So the overall consistency of a deck like this that relies on 4 specific cards to do anything really. I mean, the deck just doesn't do anything without Rot Priest. And that means that it's very inconsistent. As I said before, consistency in best of 3 is key. Otherwise, you'll just be winning like 30% of your matches, if even. I don't even know. Whatever the odds of you having Rot Priest in your opening hand and your opponent not having an answer, it's probably even lower than that, really. But there's not much to say about this deck, honestly. It is a gimmick. It will work 1 in 5 or 6 matches, maybe 1 in 5 games. So you probably lose the best of 3 anyways. There's not enough sideboard tools for it. The mana base is gonna be awkward as well. Like, you need the right colored mana at the right time. You can't really play a 2-drop because you need protection up, or your opponent has to not have it. Like, too many things need to line up for this deck to be good. And as such, it will be placed in the garbage. Trash tier. Next up, we have a deck that is much better. Much, much better. And that is Selesnya Toxic, or Selesnya Poison. This deck does not have to rely on Rot Priest, and as I said before, consistency is key, and this deck has consistency. It has many ways to start the poison train, and yeah, it relies on creatures instead of relying on non-creature spells, which is already just much better. That way, if your opponent removes something, you can just replace it with another creature. You don't have to worry too much about protecting, although you still have protection spells. So you still have the strengths of the Simic deck, but you're shedding off part of that weakness. And white is a very strong color. So yeah, honestly, this deck is not bad. Unfortunately, it doesn't line up that well in this meta, but it might be okay if we're really moving. I mean, we are already in a Atraxa meta, in my opinion. But if you look at the best decks, that would be Grixis, Esper, and Atraxa potentially. This deck has like some things that are relatively unfair. Now, I still think that without Rot Priest, without drawing Rot Priest, this deck is just a little bit too fair. So yeah, that's the problem, is that it can work without Rot Priest, but you still want the Rot Priest, and that's still a problem. In the end, that is still a problem. And having the Seed Core is really good, though. I mean, this deck has a lot more going for it, obviously. I do think it's okay, and it has decent blowout potential as well. As such, I will be placing this. Let's think of this. It's got to be tier 3, but where? Where is it? It's probably above Mardu for sure, because it's actually doing something unfair. Is it above Blue-White Mindsplice? It doesn't have blue, but it has the speed, maybe? I don't know. This is a tough one. I think they're very close. They're both trying to do something unfair that's a little bit more unreliable than just having every card in the deck be good. Honestly, I'm just gonna go off my gut feeling here. I think Selesnya Poison is actually better than Blue-White Mindsplice. I want to lower Jund Invoke as well. I think Jund is in a really weird position. But no, it's not. It's not worse. I think Jund's got to be better than. Yeah, it's got to be better than Poison. I don't think there's that much of a question. Like, it has the toolbox. It has the color combination to build a good deck, I think. That's kind of in a similar position as Mono White is against Atraxa decks. And since I put Mono White there, I should leave this as is. Yep, that makes sense to me. Dimir Poison is a deck that is just too clunky. It is a deck that relies heavily on Voidwing Hybrid, and your opponent somehow stumbling for you to have the time to set up Poison, because it's really not easy. Unfortunately, Poison counters are very difficult to set up without the Voidwing, at least. So it's kind of in a similar situation as Rot Priest, where with Rot Priest the deck functions. Without it, it kind of functions, but it's very awkward. Prologue, 2 mana, draw a card, poison your opponent. That's a really tough card to cast in this metagame. For 2 mana, like, mana efficiency is through the roof right now with cards like Fable, Bankbuster, Shield Red, I don't know, Glissa, like Rafine, the Might. So many cards are costed way too efficiently. Like their cost is so cheap compared to the amount of power they hold, right? So you casting a 2-mana draw card that effectively doesn't do anything until you set up at least 3 poison counters, and even then it's like upgrading your other spells that you need to draw, and then you need to still get your opponent to 10 poison counters. So the prerequisite of poison makes this deck much worse than if you were just playing a traditional kind of remove slash draw deck, like control deck. Traditional Dimir Control is probably just straight up better because each of your cards are going to be more impactful for their mana cost, and that will allow you to better stabilize a game. Like you won't be falling behind because you're casting a 2-mana draw card or a 3-mana sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, they get a poison counter. The efficiency is so low in this deck per card. Like each card is just simply not good enough, and that puts it in a very awkward position for a controlling deck. Dimir Poison will be going straight into... I don't want to put it at... Is this trash tier? Honestly, it might be. It might be trash tier. Is that disrespectful to... I don't know. Like, I've played this deck. I've played against it. It really does not feel good at all. Is it Simic Poison tier? Honestly, I did bring some comparisons between the deck. Like, I do think they kind of don't work without specific cards. Like, I think if you don't have hybrid, the deck's win rate plummets. Oh man, it's either like bottom of tier 4 or trash tier. I don't know. Honestly, I'm just gonna put a fucking trash tier. Who cares? Who cares? Is it really important if it's tier 4 or trash tier? Nah, probably not. Okay, it's trash tier. That's how I feel about it, at least. Okay, now we have Mono Blue, a deck that has actually gotten much better. Surprising, to me at least. A deck that has gained a land that is truly insane in Mirex, giving Mono Blue an alternate win con, which it actually desperately needs in this metagame. And Mirex is just insane. It also gained Filigree Silex, which allows you to gain a sweeper, kind of. So Silex is a card that starts at 0 counters, and you can sack it for free by tapping it. And it will destroy creatures with a CMC, or it will destroy non-land permanents with a CMC equal to the amount of oil counters on it, and you can tap it to gain an oil counter. So essentially it starts at 0, it can destroy tokens immediately, or you can bump it up once by tapping and adding an oil counter, then it goes to 1, it'll destroy everything at 1 CMC if you want to, or you can keep building it up until you're satisfied and then crack it when you need to. So very flexible kind of sweeper, although it can be too slow in some situations, but having access to that is very important for Mono Blue, a deck that has no sweeper. So yeah, very important card. And it's honestly in a decent spot right now because Atraxa is a deck that is running around, and I actually think Mono Blue has a decent shot at competing with it because it's so efficient. And Atraxa doesn't really have ways of interacting with the graveyard at all. So you can quickly, if you can quickly get out Tolarian Terrors and then counter their sweeper, you can put them in a spot where they're like nearly dead on board. And then all you have to do is like maybe they sweep you the next turn, you activate your Mirex, you slam a Jin or something, you have protection backup, and they most likely just lose the game. Like they can't, their deck is too clunky to compete with a deck as efficient as Mono Blue. And Mono Blue is consistent. And again, I think consistency is probably one of the biggest selling points in a deck right now in Standard, at least if you have, well, I guess for every deck, but specifically a blue deck that has access to counter spells. I don't really have much else to say about Mono Blue. Like, the fact that they have Flow of Knowledge as well as a huge late game boost to their card draw, it's impressive. And on the play, it is actually very difficult to contend with. I've played against Mono Blue a lot of times on ladder, and some of these matches just feel kind of impossible to win if they have a really good hand. And even when they don't, it still feels like they have a chance of coming back with the Tolarian Terrors. It's actually impressive, and it's a deck that I did not expect to see perform as well. in this metagame until we saw Atraxa, obviously. Honestly, I'm gonna put Mono Blue in tier 2 and probably at the top. Or is it worse than Izzet Ramp? Izzet Ramp is kind of like Mono Blue in the way that they have counter magic and they have very mana efficient plays, but they don't have a threat that's as efficient as Jhin, obviously. But they also have a 9 mana threat that has haste. It has access to haste. And I think that's pretty huge against Atraxa and against the other decks. Let me think. Izzet Ramp? Actually, Izzet Ramp is bad against Legends. It's okay against... No, it's not very good against Grixis. So sure, it has a good matchup against Atraxa, but I don't know if it has that that good of a matchup against the other two. Does that mean Izzet Ramp is actually supposed to be lower? I forgot that I have to... Yeah, I was just placing it that high because it's good against Atraxa, but Atraxa is not the entire meta. And I think against Esper, it's not that good. And against Grixis, it's not that good either. But I wouldn't say it's bad. Yeah, I'm definitely going to lower Izzet Ramp. It's 100% better than Jund. But I don't think it's better than Mono White. Esper Walkers over Mono White? Esper Walkers probably not super good against Grixis. Also not great against Esper. Okay, I'm going to put Mono White a little bit higher then. Yeah, but Mono White has garbage matchup into Atraxa. I don't know. How much of the meta is Atraxa? I don't even know. It's so hard for me to put Mono White below Esper Walkers. Like, I don't think Esper Walkers is consistent enough compared to Mono White. But Mono White just gets slammed by Atraxa. That's a tough one. That is a tough one. With Stonebrain, I don't... Okay, I'm going to put Mono White higher. I think Stonebrain has a chance of allowing Mono White to still contend with Atraxa. Okay, sure. Let's do that. I do think Mono Blue is better, though. Surprising, but not surprising, maybe, because it has blue. Anyways, moving on to the Atraxa Invoke deck. So I still have not played more Atraxa, but I'm gonna have to improve this list a lot. But the initial list was quite good, and now I have to contend with other Atraxa decks, so I'm gonna have to add a little bit more counter magic, maybe a little bit more overall value to try to go even more greedy than my opponents. Is actually, it's a greed matchup, and right now we are not greedy enough. I think we were greedy enough for the original Atraxa Invoke decks, Atraxa decks, I guess. But now that is probably no longer the case. Oh wait, this is the wrong order. Okay, moving on to Invoke Justice, Atraxa, Sanctuary Warden nonsense. Bring back from the graveyard stuff. This deck is clunky, inconsistent, high power, explosive. But honestly, again, consistency is key, and this deck is not consistent at all. Most of its cards are a little bit underpowered. So like most of the early game spells, like Cathartic Pyre is not a card you really want to play in this meta. Restoration is also not a card you really want to play in this meta. Bitter Reunion, I'm playing that, but I think most people are not. A Braid is not necessarily that good in this meta right now. Overall, just very low impact cards until you hit an invoke on something big, and then you're not even out of the game just yet. Like, it doesn't win you the game on the spot. They can still like remove your stuff. Farewell just slams this deck really hard. Portal is not necessarily a card that's that difficult to deal with for most decks. The deck is just too clunky. I've played this deck. I've played against it. Sure, you lose the odd game against them, but on average, it just feels like they're doing nothing. And yeah, sometimes they even invoke, like they invoke out Atraxa, And what are they hitting? Like, I don't know, one Abrade, one Burn Down, or if they get lucky to hit the other invoke. Like, it's just, they have to get lucky, hit the first invoke, nothing bad happens in the meantime, get Atraxa out, also get reasonable luck, get reasonably lucky, find another invoke, and then keep doing that. So it has too many pre-requirements. It has too many prerequisites, I think, to work. It's simply like a turn your brain off, put something in the graveyard, bring it out, and hopefully you win. And those decks are fine, but not consistent enough to be that relevant in the meta. They'll just beat up on some people randomly. Like, just, yeah, you'll win a few and then, but your average win rate will not be that high. As such, I will place Atraxa Invoke in low tier 2, I think, because it's still doing. Actually, I will place it above Jund. Okay, yeah, I'll place it above Jund because obviously it's still doing something broken, and it still has the looting to try to make that consistent. So it still manages to reach its win con reliably enough compared to a deck like the Simic Poison or Dimir Poison. Like, you're more so looking for a win con that costs 5 and you have a lot of ways to cycle through cards. So you might get there, but the question is, will you win the game when you get there? Not always, and that's kind of a problem. All right, we're almost at the end here. This is Atraxa Midrange, 5-color domain, etc., etc. So this deck is good. I think it's way better than Invoke. Again, I value consistency, and having a deck with each card being a good card means that your average draw is going to be much more powerful, and you'll have a lot more ways of just interacting better with your opponents. You have a lot more ways of interacting with creatures, with a bunch more sweepers. You have a lot of interaction for like permanence with the leyline bindings. You have alternate win cons in White Sun's Twilight with life gain. You have Wandering Emperor. You got Laran. Overall, your tech, how do I say this? The versatility of each card is much higher than just simply looting for a specific card, and that makes this a lot more powerful. Now, of course, this deck will need some improvements because this was originally good when less people were playing Atraxa, or when people were playing Atraxa decks that were not well refined. But I feel like we're gonna slowly move towards an Atraxa meta that uses blue for counter magic to beat other Atraxa decks, and that's also what this deck needs to do. So I will have to update this. I will most likely update it relatively soon to be a lot more powerful in the mirror match. But other than that, I don't have much to say about it. If you want to check out my video on it, I'll explain a lot more there. But yeah, this deck is just clearly tier 1 in my opinion. Like, there are too many ways to build it. Obviously, the trial mana base is good, so your opportunities, the potential to build a good Atraxa deck in any given meta is going to be very high. I think Atraxa is probably here to stay in some shape or form. It can only get pushed out by hard control, and even then, again, as I mentioned, you can be in blue. And if you can be in blue, that means you still have a shot against control decks. You have blue and black potentially for duress and counter magic, which means you can also contend with their own spells and potentially sneak your way through in a control meta. But we'll have to see. It depends on how controlling they are. Like, if they're like playing a really hard control deck with like a ton of card draw, that's gonna be rough. But then those decks will get pushed out by aggro. So it's like, will it ever reach a point where that's the case? Probably not. I think it will always be leaning towards a mid-range meta just because the other tier 1 decks are also good. Now, I don't think Atraxa is better than Esper or Grixis, simply because those decks are way more proactive and get started way earlier. Those two decks, Esper and Grixis, they can finish off the game in 3 turns, basically. You can go, so for Grixis, for example, you try to cast a 3-drop, they counter, they play Appraiser if it's a creature, or they play Fable themselves, and you kind of just lose the game from there. Esper can go turn 1 Might, turn 2 Thalia, turn 3 Rafine, and you're done. But Atraxa, they have to do a little bit more. They have to stabilize the board in the mid game before they play Atraxa, potentially find a way to boost their mana for Atraxa. They have to find Atraxa and they have to resolve it. So the overall consistency is going to be there, but the speed is not. The speed for Atraxa is not there. And that means that for them to lock up the game, you have to go through the motions a little bit longer. And that can be a little bit troublesome against certain decks. And against Grixis, for example, Atraxa versus Grixis, they will most likely have counter magic up in time for Atraxa, at least game one. And they also have better or a more efficient card advantage than Atraxa does. And Esper can simply blow them out quickly with like Urtai held up for a sweeper, and then they just get completely dominated on board and on life. So Atraxa is tier 1, but I don't think it's at the top. But again, I'm not sure which one between Grixis and Esper is better. I'm just prioritizing the one that has a better matchup against the other two, because Esper against Atraxa, it can go very wrong. Like if they had a drag at the right time, that's rough. If they hit their ley lines correctly, that could be rough as well. So these two are about, in their matchup, they're about even, but I think Grixis has a decent matchup at the Esper, and it has a very good matchup into mid-range. So yeah, that is what I think about Atraxa Midrange. I think it's a really good deck that is probably here to stay, but I don't know if it will actually ever be truly at the top of the metagame. But these decks are all very close. Like it's not like Grixis edging out by a lot. They're all about even, and that's what's beautiful about this meta. There's no like Grixis dominating the metagame anymore. Mostly because you have all the other decks, and some of these Grixis will lose pretty hard to, like Mono White and potentially Walkers. Whoops. And last but not least, we have Esper Control. Esper Control is in a good spot. It has blue, as I said, it has black for removal, and it has white for sweepers. So it's combining elements of each color's interaction, and it's doing that extremely well. It has access to some key cards like Void Rend, which are cards that are extremely good. Cards that go through counter spells, through wards, can hit any permanents, so very flexible. They have really good card draw. They have cards that add consistency to the deck, like a Siphon Insight that can grab your opponent's lands, also can grab your opponent's win cons, but that's another story. It also has the 1 mana Surveil 3 spell that has flashback. I don't remember the name, but that card is extremely good for digging and extremely good for allowing you to consistently hit mana and hit your spells in time. And that is key for control decks. So it really enables the entire thing, I think, the 1 mana card. That's been a really very important addition to the deck. And I think it pushes Esper Control to new heights with additions like Murex as well. You also have access to counter magic, obviously. And of course, Deluge being a fantastic spell. Planeswalkers that are good, like, well, actually, one Planeswalker is just a Wandering Emperor. Wandering Emperor being really broken. But White Sun's Twilight, like, I don't know, the deck has incredible tools and incredible card advantage. Now, the problem is it does not have great ways to stabilize from like a board. Let's say, yeah, it doesn't have, what I mean is they don't have good blockers. Yeah, it's lacking good blockers, and that can be a problem against other people playing Murex. It can definitely be a problem in some cases where you really don't want to spend a sweeper, but you don't have a blocker, so you don't want to spend spot removal either, because most of your spot removal is like really important. It can get out of hand, but the deck still has very good legs, I think, and maybe there's a way to adapt it to be impactful enough against everything in tier 1 here, and potentially against most of the random decks, that this might be a contender for top of the metagame. Not tier 1, I think, but I would place Esper Control solidly in tier 2. I do not know if it's worse or better than Mono Blue, because Mono Blue has good blockers. And I think that's the big difference, is that Mono Blue has some proactive elements, and I feel like proactive elements are worth a lot. I'm hesitant to even put it above Mono White, to be honest. Let's see. Esper Control theoretically has good matchups into Atraxa. Actually, it has like a very good matchup into Atraxa. Against Grixis, not great. Fable's a problem. Bankbuster's a problem. And against Esper, it's okay. While Mono White has good matchup into Grixis, pretty good matchup into Esper, and garbage matchup into Atraxa. I think Mono White's a little bit ahead, just from a consistency standpoint. Yeah, I would still leave Mono White ahead of Esper Control. But this is it only in theory. So yeah, again, Mono White is only here because I value these two decks. If everybody's playing Atraxa, then this is just unplayable. So it'd be like here, right? No, it would be okay. Let's assume Atraxa is just everywhere. Then this would drop. This would drop here. But when I'm rating decks, I am rating them according to what I think is tier 1, and Mono White has good matchups into this. So what you have to think about is not like, okay, everybody's playing Atraxa, this deck, why is this deck in tier 2? But like, this deck beats Atraxa, and this deck is good against this. This deck can beat Atraxa, and can beat this deck can beat anything, and this deck is kind of good against Esper. So it's only bad against one of them, but this might be the most popular, and that's the problem, right? And you don't really, I guess you wouldn't want to, but again, with Stonebrain, the hope is Stonebrain, right? I'm really hoping that Stonebrain can potentially help. Like removing Atraxa, that gives you something. That gives you something good. I don't know if it's enough though. My evaluation of Mono White might be too high. I think my evaluation of Mono White might be too high. Like if you were going to a tournament, you would never bring this, right? I'm only rating this for ladder. For ranked ladder. And on ladder, I still think Mono White has decent value unless you're facing Atraxa all the time. I'm just gonna lower it. I don't know. I mean, there's a reason nobody's playing Mono White, right? It's just because everybody's on this deck. Even though I think these are better decks, nobody is realistically playing them compared to Atraxa. Or at least not enough. Yeah, I'm gonna lower this. I'm gonna put it below all the blue decks. Might put it below Invoke. Let's do this. I'm okay with that. Like, sure, it has good matchups into these, but if these are just not represented enough, then you're just gonna lose to Atraxa every game. It's just, yeah, it's just rough. This was just theoretical. Like, if we're looking at all things equal, 66, let's say 33%, 33%, 33%, which is not realistic, then this would be up here, right? But more realistically, this is like way higher representation than these. So yeah, this looks a lot better to me. Esper Walkers. I don't know. I don't know about Esper Walkers either. This feels like it might be worse than Izzet, just because Izzet has like proactive win cons that are a lot faster, I think. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, Walker's not great against Esper. Yeah, okay, I'm lowering that. I'll put this. I'll put this here. I think Atraxa is doing more broken things, the Invoke version. That puts it a little bit higher. Yeah, this looks fine to me. Izzet Ramp has a horrendous matchup into Legends, though. A very bad matchup into Mono White as well. Pretty mediocre matchup into Esper Control. Actually, it's not that bad into Esper Control. No, it's not that bad. I don't know. I think I'm going to leave Izzet Ramp high because I really think it has a good matchup into Atraxa potentially. Yeah, I think that's the case. Like it has leveler, giving them the what is it? The power stones, I don't think is a huge problem. You can free other stuff from leyline bindings on cast. You can gain more mana to hold up counter magic. I mean, these two matchups are not great, but again, since I rated Mono White lower because of Atraxa, I should do the same for the other decks, which means that this facing mostly Atraxa I think is good. Okay, I'll leave it like this. I think this is the final list here. I would say. Is Mono Black better than Abzan Legends? Honestly, probably. I'm not sure about my rating about Mono Black either. I think Mono Black is just more consistent than Abzan, so I should put it higher. Yeah, this looks better. That makes more sense, I think. I really don't like this deck, and I don't think Rakdos is like that good either. Yeah. At least Mono Black has like consistent aggression for the most part. I like this. I'm happy with this. Sure. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, go ahead and comment down below where you would place some decks. Obviously, this is just my opinion. This is how I see the metagame right now, as it is with the Atraxa on the rise. Yeah, I will be making this kind of content for Patreon more often, and when the metagame shifts a little bit, so I can keep people up to date on what I think is the best deck, and I'll also be making like mini guides of how to build certain lists to build against the tier 1 deck. So like if I plan on running Esper Control, I'll explain like how to beat Atraxa, how to beat the tier 1 decks, like how I would adapt to the metagame with those decks. So it'd be more of a strategic tier list, not really a tier list, but a strategic ranking of decks and how to adapt to that metagame. So you can head on over there if you want to see that. Every so often. It won't be that often because it needs the metagame to change so I can change my rankings and then try to update how to adapt to that metagame. But yeah, anyways, that will be done over there on top of all my deck building guides, my strategic guides, my game theory guides, and additional gameplay, of course. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.